Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Hitting the Ground Running, Reviewing the 17 CMMC Level 1 Practices. Today, we're going to provide you with insights regarding how to evaluate and assess your organization's readiness for meeting the practice requirements of CMMC Level 1. I am Matt Trevors. I'll be your host for the next 30 minutes, and I'm a technical manager here at the Software Engineering Institute. Today, I am joined by my friend and colleague, Gavin Jurecko. Gavin, welcome to the program.
Good afternoon, Matt. How are you doing? My name is Gavin Jurecko. I am a senior member of the technical staff here at the Software Engineering Institute in the CERT division. I've been here for the last 7 years working with critical infrastructure sectors and more recently the defense industrial base, designing assessment tools to help baseline their security readiness.
Great. Well, Gavin, thanks very much for joining me. I just want to cover a couple items. First of all, folks, sorry for the delay. A little hitch in the giddy up, as my friend Charles would say. So I just want to set some ground rules. We're only going to talk about publicly available information today, and all the documents that Gavin and I will discuss are actually going to be posted in the description below. Second, we're really not going to talk about how the accreditation body is going to govern assessments. Again, we will have the link in the description below. So you can go to www.cmmcab.org for guidance around when see-through PAOs will be established and when you can begin to schedule your assessment. Also, finally, I'm going to check the chat from time to time, and I'll interject questions from the chat into the conversation as it becomes relevant. So Gavin, if you're ready, we'll get started.
Sounds good.
All right, cool. So Gavin, can you briefly describe why is CMMC a maturity model?
Yeah, so in general, a maturity model is a set of characteristics, attributes, indicators, or patterns that represent capability and progression in a particular discipline. So with CMMC, we wanted to work with the government to set a benchmark against which organizations can evaluate their current level of capability and processes and practices. So what this measurement criteria looks like from a CMMC perspective, it's based across 5 levels. And the goal is for CMMC to be cost effective and affordable for smaller businesses to implement at lower levels. So the idea being that not everyone handles controlled unclassified information. So not everyone should have to be at various levels of the model. So the lower levels allow organizations to prove that they're doing their basic cyber hygiene and essentially proving that they're doing a base level of effort to protect information that the government is giving them. And then level 3 would represent CUI handling, and levels 4 and 5 of the model then represent more advanced programs.
Okay, so it sounds like the farther up the model, the more sensitive information you will receive, and therefore the government has a higher risk or a higher sensitivity to protecting that information, so therefore their risk is higher, so therefore they expect more to protect that information.
That's correct. Yeah, the practices become more advanced, and then you get into the processes, the maturity aspect that's also built upon what you have in place.
Okay, great. So there are a substantial number of practices within the model. How did we come up with these couple hundred of practices?
Yeah, so the CMMC effort builds upon an existing regulations such as DFARS and whatnot. So we're adding a verification component to the already established trust component. We looked at various cybersecurity standards. So 800.171 played a big role, 853. Here at CERT, we used the resilience management model that played a role. We looked at various international standards, and the team kind of mapped all of those and through various iterations came up. So the requirements aren't new. They're just pulled upon from different sources to kind of create a superset that members handling controlled unclassified information would have to ultimately satisfy.
Okay, great. So we basically took a multitude of standards, picked the best from them, and the ones that would be most cost effective and best bang for your buck. That's what it sounds like we did. Would you agree?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, great. So, I know like you, I have lots of conversations and I check various sources for information with regards to CMMC. And something I often see misconstrued is practices and an assessment. So Gavin, can you briefly describe the difference between a level 1 practice and a level 1 assessment?
Sure. So whenever you're going to get CMMC certified, you're going to be certified at a specific level. So let's take level 3, for example. You are going to be required to show that you're doing all of the practices at level 1, level 2, and level 3. So at level 3, there is process maturity baked into that. A level 1 practice is simply at level 1, here's the things you should be doing. So if we say that you're doing CMMC certification level 1, this is the subset of requirements you have to meet. And with that, there is no process maturity. So the distinction here is, are you doing these practices? They could be ad hoc. They could be documented to help show that, the evidence that you're doing this. But whenever you're doing the same practice at a level 3, you would also have to show that there's policy backing this practice. It's sufficiently staffed. There's plans in place on how you're performing these practices for a given domain and whatnot. So there's an added level of complexity to the assessment piece, but the level 1 practice is really just the subset of practices that a level 1 organization would have to satisfy.
Okay. So again, I'll go back to if you're chasing a CMMC level 1 contract, it's likely that you have limited information. So you'll only need to achieve level 1 certification, and you won't have to go through process maturity. You'll just have to implement the 17 practices. But if you're going for a level 3, you still have to implement those practices, but they come with additional work because now you have to do the process maturity components of those practices.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So think of the processes are kind of attributes on how you enhance doing the practices. So you're not just doing the practices, but now you're actively having policy, you're actively resourcing it, you're actively planning, you're actively measuring these things. So it's attributes that you add on to the base practice at its simplest level.
Okay. So other interesting questions I hear from folks is, how do you go about determining how should an organization determine what portion of their organization will be affected by CMMC?
Right. So the scoping discussion becomes very important. It's really going to set the boundary of what would be in scope of the assessment and what wouldn't be. So traditionally with cybersecurity and security, you're thinking of mainly your technology assets, but you really also want to think of all the people that are involved, all of the information, and all of the facilities that would be involved with this effort as well. So think about what DoD contracts you have and what information, what technology, what facilities support that. Now, sometimes you could be a smaller organization and the answer is everything, but other times you could be a large organization and there's just a subset. You would not want to, if you didn't have to, you can, siphon those off and only scope in the required assets and prove that you're doing the practices or processes depending on what level for those.
Okay, great. So, I hear from the various discussions that some people are concerned that this is going to be a heavy lift. How would you encourage an organization to get started preparing for CMMC?
Right. So, there's various tools out there that kind of can baseline your capabilities, but I would suggest utilizing some tool that you can kind of baseline where you are today. Here at CERT, we work with a number of organizations within the government that offer some tools that can help you baseline not only some practices that would map back to CMMC, but also the maturity aspects. So with DHS, we help support the Cyber Resilience Review. And with DC3 and the DICE, the DIB cybersecurity cybersecurity information sharing program, we have another tool called the cyber resilience analysis. These are both tools that you can have a third party come to your organization, have a 6 to 8 hour discussion, and provide a pretty good baseline of where you stand with regards to that methodology. Within those tools, depending on what tool you're using, we have crosswalks and depictions of how well you're covering concepts in 800-171, the NIST cybersecurity framework, which then you can use to get back to the CMMC model.
Okay. And then just to top on that, down in the description, we actually have a link. So if you're a member of the DIB and you're not familiar with DC3 or the DICE program, feel free to reach out to them through the information below.
Yeah, so and the other stuff
Gavin.
that I would point you to is just the model documentation. So as we were writing the model, we were taking existing guidance, and anywhere that we have felt there was pain points or we heard from the community that there were pain points, we added clarification sections, as well as existing 171 assessment guidance. So look at the assessment guidance and really look at the objectives of each requirement and understand what that practice is really trying to get at.
Okay, great. So I just want to step away from CMMC for a second, and I just want to address some of the concerns. So I have experience with information security audits outside of CMMC, and what I don't want the folks in the DIB to think about these audits as, you know, a detective pulling you into a room and shining an eye in your face and demanding you answer questions. That's not what this is at all. What this is the C3PAOs or the C3PAOs are there to help you tell your story to the DoD at how you meet their objectives. So you're going to construct a factual narrative. So look at the assessments and begin to look at how you would implement those or how you believe you're meeting those objectives and start to tell the story. And then when you begin to, so that would be the self-assessment. So then when you contact the C3PAO, you'll be able to show them that you've already hit the ground running, right? To quote the topic, and that's very important, right? And then other things to consider is I like to bucket them into proactive and reactive audits. A reactive audit is absolutely an IRS audit, right? If you do your taxes improperly, the IRS is coming to make sure that they're not misinterpreting your numbers. Also, if you run afoul of HIPAA or some other regulation and the regulatory body comes pounding, that's very much a reactive audit. For the most part, CMMC, especially initially, is a very proactive audit. Again, you are engaging with the C3PAO to help tell your story to the DoD at how you meet the objectives within the CMMC level that you are trying to attain. Gavin, anything to add? Or
yeah, that's exactly correct. I mean, the practices that we put into the model were not written to have specific implementations in mind, but it's trying to give people the flexibility to meet the objectives of the practice and tell how they are meeting those practices. So that's exactly how I view it as well. This is your opportunity to understand the practices and present those of how your organization is performing those to the assessors.
Perfect. So we're pressed for time here. We're going to try to move this along. So Gavin, can you just give the audience a brief discussion or a brief synopsis of CMMC Level 1?
Sure. So the CMMC model has 17 domains, and for Level 1 practices, we're only covering 6 of those domains. So you'll find practices in access control, identification and authentication, media protection, physical protection, system and communications protection, and system and information integrity. There is no process maturity element at level 1, so none of the processes come into play until level 2 and above. And for the most part, level 1 really aligns to the federal acquisition regulations, and all of the practices in level 1 map directly back to existing 800-171 requirements. So again, these aren't new. These have been around for the last couple years, but now they're in a kind of tiered fashion. Also, level 1, because there is no process maturity, it's largely ad hoc how you're performing these practices. So the level of effort for an assessor, it could be self-attestation, but verify that you're doing this. Some of it might require documentation, or documentation might help you explain how you're doing these things, but it's not a hard, fast criteria of what the assessor is going to be looking for. It's more of, for level 1, are you doing these things and how are you doing them? So the barrier to entry for level 1 as far as evidence collection and should be a lot lighter than something like level 2, where now you're required to have policy and documented practices, and then level 3 you're required to have a plan and have appropriate resources to staff that plan.
Okay, great. So with that, I'll jump right in to access control, AC 1.001, limit information system access to authorized users, process acting on behalf of authorized users or devices, including other information systems. And folks, what I'm going to do is we're going to use the CMMC model appendices for 1.02, but also we're going to pull on 800-171A because it has very good information with regards to requirements objectives. So I will pull on that. So for this requirement, you'll see that we're mapped to 3.1.1 in the model appendices. And 3.1.1 has 6 objectives. Authorized users are identified, processes acting on behalf of users are identified, devices authorized are identified, system access is limited to authorized users, processes acting on behalf of authorized users or devices. System access is limited to authorized devices. Gavin, can you give the audience a little sneak peek into how we would interpret that?
Yeah, so this practice is really getting at the very least, anonymous access to your system should be disabled. The users that are on your system should have their own username and password. This practice is largely connected with some other practices that we're going to go over as well. But any of the devices or the systems that are on your network or within the scope boundary, again, this goes back to the scoping of the assessment, they're authorized to be on there. So this is more than just somebody is able to plug in or connect a tablet to your wireless. This is ensuring that you know what's on your network, what users are authorized to use it, and you limit that system access to those authorized users, processes, or devices.
Right. So as you mentioned, try to limit anonymous access or eliminate it. Give folks, right. So this is authorization. So this is different than authentication. So I'm just going to move on to AC.1.002, limit information system access to the types of transactions and functions that authorized users are permitted to execute. From 171A, the types of transactions and functions that authorized users are permitted to execute are defined, and system access is limited to the defined types of transactions and functions for authorized users. Gavin?
Yeah, so if you look at that practice, we just discussed 2 objectives. So the types of functions and transactions are permitted, are defined, and system access is limited to those defined actions. So really what an organization would want to think about here is access control lists at the very least, lists for need to know or different data classifications, something like role-based access control, attribute-based access control. Some of these may be getting into more complex implementations, but these are the types of things that can help you explain how you're doing these. So for role-based access control, what functions are you giving general users? What functions are you giving administrators? Things like that.
Right. So for these first 2, you were basically making sure your access was limited to users, processes, or devices. And now you're further limiting those access to only conduct functions that they are supposed to be doing, right? So you're not going to get every user. Maybe they're authorized to use the system, but they're not authorized to do administrative functions.
That's correct.
Okay. So AC 1.003, verify and control limit connections to and use of external information systems. So connections to external information systems are identified. The use of external information or of external systems is identified. Connections to external systems are verified. The use of external systems is verified. Connections to external systems are controlled, limited, and the use of external systems is controlled, limited.
Yeah, so again, Matt had just gone over the objectives of this requirement. So think about how your organization would answer those questions. So guidelines and restrictions placed on the use of personally owned or external system access. So think about somebody coming in to the organization and they want to connect a tablet or their own notebook. Is that even allowed? Do you have any type of policy that would prevent that? But also think about OneDrive, iCloud drives, stuff like that. Do you have VPN connection requirements? Do you use proxies? Stuff like that. It's really kind of taking a critical look at your system that's scoped in CMMC and identifying where these external points could be and establishing the requirements to identify, use, and control the use of those or limit the use. And some of these could be technical controls, and some of these could be administrative-based controls.
Right. And I think it's also important, Gavin, as we mentioned about scoping a little bit earlier, that external may actually refer to an internal system in a different part of the company, depending on how you've scoped your CMMC assessment. Would you agree?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I mean, when you get into some of these organizations, it could be very complex, and you don't want to be scoping in systems that don't really require the access to the contract side of things, the DoD contract side of things. So it could be an internal system that's external to the CMMC boundary even.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so AC 1.004. Control information posted or processed on publicly accessible information systems. Oh, excuse me. Sorry, Gavin. Individuals authorized to post or process information on publicly accessible systems are identified. CUI is not posted or processed on publicly accessible systems. A review process is in place. Content on publicly accessible systems is reviewed to ensure that it does not include CUI. And finally, mechanisms are in place to remove and address improper posting of CUI.
Right. So this comes down to do you have publicly accessible information, and do you have an authorized individual to post that? Do you have workflows in place so this authorized individual just isn't posting whatever he wants, but there's checks and balances? You could even use some type of content management system that's out there. And a lot of the times these content management systems have workflow plugins, but it's ensuring that someone isn't just posting information. There's a process that is being gone through to ensure that the information being posted is allowed and done in the proper way.
Right. And I just want to pull on that thread about the content management system. So using a workflow, so somebody develops some content that they want to publish, and then somebody else has to approve it. Now at level 1, you don't necessarily have to have all this documented, right? You just need to be able to prove, or at least our interpretation of how the assessment methodology will work is you only have to prove that that is being executed. You don't have to show them artifacts that it's written down. But Gavin, is that sort of what you would expect for a CMMC level 1 assessment? Is if you're doing this practice that you would just need to show the auditor that, hey, we have this plugin, and when we want to publish new content, only Alice or Bob are allowed to actually put that into production.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that the barrier to entry for it is lower. So can the organization say, well, Alice and Bob are approved to posting this. We have this discussion before it's done, and they kind of walk them through the process. That would be the barrier there. Now, when you get to level 2, again, that's where the documentation comes in. So is there a documented process that shows this? Do you have a paper trail of approvals, whatever that may be? So again, the barrier to entry is we're just trying to see that at level 1, instead of just doing something, you're looking at these requirements and satisfying the objectives of these practices.
Perfect. Okay. So we're going to move on to identification and authentication. So access control was largely about authorized. And now we're talking about identification and authentication. So if you look at identification, authentication, authorization. So a little bit backwards, but this is the way they are in the model assessment. So IA.1.007 or 076, identify information system users, process acting on behalf of users or devices. So users, processes acting on behalf of users, and devices are identified. So Gavin, can you just walk us through that?
Yeah, so this one's, self-explanatory for the most part. I mean, all system users are uniquely identified. So think of, the usernames that you give your users. Addresses individual identifiers that are not necessarily associated with system accounts. So think of all of the devices that are on your network. Do you uniquely identify them, whether it's a 3-letter subsystem word and then device type, like it's a switch or a router, and then a unique code? It's trying to ensure that anything that is on your network is uniquely identified. So as we build into level 2 or logging is required, you can start to trace back that this log came from this specific device and so on. But at level 1, we're trying to say you need to uniquely identify everything that's within scope of the CMMC assessment.
Right. Great. All right. IA.1.077, authenticate or verify the identities of those users, processes, or devices as a prerequisite to allowing access to organizational information systems. So the identity of each user is authenticated or verified as a prerequisite to system access. The identity of each process acting on behalf of a user is authenticated or verified as a prerequisite to system access, and the identity of each device accessing or connecting to the system is authenticated or verified as a prerequisite to system access.
Yeah, so again, this is kind of taking that a step more and saying you should have passwords or key cards or cryptographic devices. I mean, traditionally, the authentication is something the user knows, so a password or a PIN, something the user possesses, like a token or a smart card, or something the user is based on. So think of biometrics. This is a good example in the model where, we're just trying to say at level 1, do you authenticate the identities of users, processes, devices? But there's requirements in level 2 that say, okay, well, if you use passwords, you must have this minimum complexity. And then when you get to level 3, it's saying you must use multi-factor authentication. So in this particular chain, there is a progression of capabilities here, but at this level, it's for those users that you've uniquely identified. Have you put in the means to authenticate those devices onto your network?
Right. So, as Gavin mentioned, capability progression, I hope that the folks are saying we tried to group these and create capability progression so it made sense. So as he mentioned, right now we're just talking about implementing one principle of authentication. So something you know, something you have, something you are. And then at the second level, we build. So if you're using passwords, we're demanding or encouraging you, sorry, not demanding, encouraging you to use NIST as your guideline for minimum password length. And then finally, multi-factor authentication. So putting in 2 or more of those factors. Okay, moving on to media protection. So MP.1.118, sanitize or destroy information system media containing federal contract information before disposal or release for reuse. So 2 things here: system media containing FCI, including CUI as appropriate, is sanitized or destroyed before disposal, and system media containing FCI, including CUI, as appropriate, is sanitized before it is released for reuse. So we're basically talking about if it's going to be destroyed or if you're going to put it back into circulation.
Right. So pay particular attention here to digital and non-digital media. So when people print something out in the organization, how are you going to take the steps to dispose of that? Are you using shredders, shred bins? Also for the digital media, procedures to wipe hard drives, decommission devices. Also take special note of printers or mobile devices. These are often forgot about by smaller organizations, but anything you print is stored on a hard drive in that printer a lot of the time, and it may stay there forever, or there may be options to erase that. But it's knowing that before you decommission that printer, have you wiped the hard drives in the printer or whatever memory is in there to ensure that any of the sensitive information you may have passed through there is not there. But the intent for this practice is to present a methodical approach for how your organization would release or reuse your digital and non-digital media or your devices before, either decommissioning them or putting them out for some other user to use.
Right. So just to add on to that, if you're considering destroying hard drives or other media, there are utilities that you can use to wipe your hard drive. So there's a concept called a DoD3 wipe, which just wipes over the drive with three different iterations of bits, so that it makes it, I don't want to say unretrievable, but extremely difficult for somebody to retrieve. Also, you have degaussing is another way, or even crypto shredding is a more modern way. And if you look, you'll look in the appendices of the model, you'll see lots of references to NIST standards. So, for instance, in this case, NIST SP 800-88 will talk about how you can go about destroying media or preparing it for recirculation. So that's there's a lot of little nuggets in the model for you to pick up on. And if you don't quite understand something, feel free to refer to those NIST standards to help you get a better understanding of what the practice is asking. Okay, moving on to physical protection. And these ones are going to be very light lists, I think, in physical protection. So PE 1.131, limit physical access to organizational information systems, equipment, and their respective operating environments to authorized individuals. There's four objectives. Authorized individuals, allowed physical access are identified. Physical access to organizational systems is limited to authorized individuals. Physical access to equipment is limited to authorized individuals. And physical access to operating environments is limited to authorized individuals. Gavin, take it away.
Sure. So at the basic sense, this applies to not publicly accessible areas, and you're going to want to think about having authorized personnel access lists. So at a very minimum, it could be a spreadsheet or whatever of who you've given access to. But as you start to implement some of these features in your organization, whether it's badges, smart cards, locks, guards, cameras, you can start to build this list automatically depending on the solution you've implemented. But it's really trying to say we've took a hard look at this and we know who we've limited our system access to, and you can prove that you've thought about these things.
Right. And I think it's important to call out two things. We're asking you to identify and then also make sure that those identified individuals are also authorized. So just because somebody has a CAC or some other form of identification doesn't mean they're authorized. That simply means they've been identified. So it's two parts, right? It's identifying the users and then authorizing the users. So PE 1.132, escort visitors and monitor visitor activity. This is an easy one. Visitors are escorted and visitor activity is monitored. Gavin?
Yeah. So I don't have too much to add to this one, but it's, anybody that isn't an authorized user or not part of your organization, are you escorting and monitoring their activities? So audit logs can be used to monitor visitor activity. I don't have too much more to add to this practice.
Right. I would just say if you were trying to provide evidence for this practice to an auditor, it would be really handy if you had access to the paper logs or even a digital log if you had it. So perhaps you have paper logs for each day that you have visitors in. Perhaps you scan them into a repository, and when the audit comes up and the auditor asks for information, you can simply refer to those logs as your evidence for having to execute or meeting or conforming with that practice. So PE 1.133, maintain audit logs of physical access. Oops, excuse me. Gavin, can you go ahead and talk about this one?
Yeah, so for these, I mean, you can use procedural written logs or automated logs. So if you've granted access to somebody using a badge reader, there's going to be an instance of that person badging into that room. It would then create a log event. You can use that, or simply just having a sign-in list to refer back to at a different time. These are, it's just ensuring that you're maintaining a log of the physical access for the devices that are in scope.
Okay, great. PE.1.134, control and manage physical access devices. Physical access devices are identified. Physical access devices are controlled, and physical access devices are managed. Gavin, can you describe what we just, those objectives?
So in the context of the model, the physical access devices are stuff like keys, locks, combinations, card readers, ensuring that they're managed. You have methods to ensure the proper check-in, check-out of keys, locks, or say somebody has a badge, an employee has a badge, but they forget it for the day. Do you have appropriate controls in place to say, okay, no problem, here's a separate way to get them a temporary badge? They're assigned to that temporary badge for the day, and you can, manage that appropriately. Also, one thing that we see, there's your traditional IT network stuff, but then whenever you get into some of these badge or card readers, there's a different group that normally handles the facility aspect. So this would also be keeping up with security updates for card readers and badging systems, making sure that what devices you use there are actually getting updated via vendor patches and whatnot. That can play into how you're managing the physical devices as well.
Right. And I just want to pull on that word manage. So when we talk about manage, we're talking about a life cycle, right? You have to create or install these. If you're talking about a badge access reader, you need to install it, and you need to update it as it needs firmware updates or perhaps it needs a new access control list, or even delete them. Perhaps that room no longer needs to be locked. So I think it's key to be able to show that you are actually managing the physical access devices.
Right.
Yeah, okay. Moving on to system and communication protection, SC 1.175, monitor, control, and protect organizational communications at the external boundaries and key internal boundaries of the information system. So the system boundaries are defined, they're monitored, controlled, and protected. That applies to both external and key internal boundaries.
Yeah, so this is one where you can kind of go down a rabbit hole and discuss these, ad nauseum. But at the very minimum, this is also going to help with the scoping discussion. So, have you identified your external and internal boundaries? Are you monitoring those boundaries? How are you controlling them? Are you only allowing one-way flow of information? Are you blocking certain things? How are you protecting them? Is there network intrusion detection installed at these boundaries? Whatever that is, typical network communication boundaries or technologies you would implement are gateways, routers, firewalls, VPNs, DMZs. So these are the things that you're going to want to leverage and identify and say, okay, we've identified these boundaries, and here's how we're doing these different things to control the access between the boundaries.
Right. And I think we're starting to get into the realm of having to consider if organizations start to embed cloud services. So infrastructure as a service, software as a service, or platform as a service. We're not just talking about on-premise. So if you have extended your environment, especially that part of the environment that is in scope for CMMC, you also need to be able to show that you're monitoring, controlling, protecting your communications between your on-premise site and the cloud, right? Gavin, would you agree?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And depending on what cloud solution your organization decides to use, some of them have been certified against specific standards that can definitely help you prove that, at least on their end, they're taking appropriate precautions. But that doesn't completely get your organization off the hook. There's oftentimes things that your organization would also have to implement to become compliant with a specific require or practice.
Right. So one thing I'd like to address there is we have to remember that you can outsource responsibility, but you cannot outsource accountability. So just because you're using a cloud provider doesn't mean that you're off the hook, especially if some cloud providers become CMMC certified. You would still be on the hook to make sure that they are meeting the objectives. Also, that likely will not get you off the hook for the maturity processes at a higher level. So you still need to have procedures written that determine how you are using those controls or those services within the cloud. Also, you're going to need to have the policy and you're going to need to have the metrics. Now, you may be able to pull on the cloud provider for that, but by no means is using a cloud provider an easy way to meet the needs of CMMC. Gavin, any thoughts on that?
No, I think you pretty much hit the valid points for that.
Okay, perfect. So SC 1.176 implements subnetworks for publicly accessible system components that are physically or logically separated from internal networks. So two objectives here: publicly accessible system components are identified, and subnetworks for publicly accessible system components are physically or logically separated from internal networks. Gavin?
Yeah, so based on the objectives, do you have publicly accessible system components? Can you identify where those are? That might relate back to the previous practice of where the boundaries are. And can you identify how you either physically or logically separate them? So physically, are they completely off of your main network and tied in some other way, or do you logically separate them in some way? It's really about identifying that specific type of access and how you separate it.
Right, and examples of this may be a publicly accessible FTP server, a publicly accessible web server, or even your SMTP server, stuff like that. You need to first identify, right? So one of the key points of this is making sure you identify, show the auditor that you know where your publicly accessible systems are, and then further go on to show them how they are public or how they are physically or logically separated. Okay, so now we're moving on to system and information integrity. SI.1.210, identify, report, and correct information and information system flaws in a timely manner. So we're going to define the time within which to identify system flaws is specified. System flaws are identified within the specified time frame. The time within which to report system flaws is specified. System flaws are reported within the specified time frame. The time within which to correct system flaws is specified, and system flaws are corrected within the specified time frame. Gavin, what say you?
Yeah, so traditionally this is going to be your patching, service packs, hot fixes, antivirus signatures, but it's ensuring that this isn't a process that you're doing at a frequency for consistency. So how often do you look for these? Where do you go to look? So have you identified your vendors that you subscribe for security updates? Think about not just the vendors of the products you're using, but also try and leverage organizations out there like US CERT, NDISAC, or other information sharing organizations. Again, whenever you're implementing some of these fixes, test them if possible before implementing. That might not be possible all the time, but it's always good to test. But it's really trying to say, rather than just spitballing these things, you are running off a process of here's when you can expect us to be doing these fixes and how often and how you kind of report those out.
Right. So just one thing I wanted to pull on, Gavin, that you discussed is you need to know your vendors. So you need to know who you should subscribe to their mailing list, especially the ones regarding security. So, some of the big operating system players, cloud providers, they all have mailing lists that you can subscribe to that are going to make it much easier for you to receive that information within your organization and apply the applicable security patches, not only to meet the guidance of CMMC, but also to maintain your security or your resilience within your organization. I think that's also key. We're not just doing this to meet CMMC, we're doing this to make our organization more resilient and more secure. Gavin, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the ultimate goal is for your organization to run as efficiently as possible. So these are the activities that are going to allow that and allow you to catch things that might, to quote Matt earlier, have a hitch in your giddy up.
Right. Thanks, Charles. All right, so SI.1.211, provide protection from malicious code at appropriate locations within organizational information systems. Designated locations for malicious code protection are identified, and protection from malicious code at designated locations is provided.
Yeah, so the two objectives here are, have you identified where you need this malicious code protection? So the antivirus, stuff like that. Have you identified that? And then for where you've identified that, are you actually implementing those protections into the systems based on the scope of the CMMC audit?
Okay. Right. So again, I'm going to point out the entry points, right? So at appropriate locations. So that could be your email server, web servers, anything publicly facing. That would ultimately be places where you would want to show the auditor that you are protecting your or information systems. Okay, folks. On to SI1.212, update malicious code protection mechanisms where new releases are available. Gavin, do you want to give us a rundown on that one?
Yeah, so this is kind of a build on of the previous one, and also the next one is they kind of all go together. But now that you've implemented these protections, are you updating the signatures? Are you updating what the code protection is going to be looking for? It's ensuring that you didn't just implement something and forget about it, but you're keeping up with the changing times and ensuring that new protections are in place to account for the latest attack paths or vectors, whatever.
Okay, right. So as you mentioned, you want to make sure that as soon as it is reasonably possible, you want to try to implement your code protections. All right, and then we're on to the last one, SI.1.213. Perform periodic scans of the information systems and real-time scans of files from external sources as files are downloaded, opened, and executed. And we're trying to achieve three objectives. The frequency for malicious code scans is identified. Malicious code scans are performed within the defined frequency, and real-time malicious code scans of files from external sources as files are downloaded, opened, or executed are performed.
Right. So these objectives, I mean, with a lot of the technology that's available today, this might all be happening in real time. But for those instances where whatever it might be, whether it's an isolated system or it's an older technology but still in scope, it's ensuring that you have a frequency for what you're going to scan it. You are actually scanning according to that defined frequency. And then for the last objective, the real-time scans, a lot of the technology, as I said, you can configure these products to do these things as people in your organization are downloading, opening, or executing different things. So it's just kind of taking that critical eye and ensuring that this practice is in place and being properly performed for your in-scope systems of the CMMC assessment.
Perfect. So something that I think of when I read this practice is, a lot of recent antivirus vendors will do this as part of their package. So it's not uncommon for real-time scan capabilities to be available within antivirus. Also, when opened and executed, so I know some of them will talk about, hey, if you contract ransomware and it starts to move around your system encrypting files, it'll detect that activity and it'll detect it as abnormal. And it'll actually help you prevent the spread of ransomware throughout your system so you don't lose total system access. So for this one, for those folks merely going for a level 1 assessment, you may want to check your antivirus product to see that it, at least in part, meets the objective for this practice. Gavin, any other thoughts?
Not specifically for this practice.
Okay, great. So folks, we've just made it through all of the 17 practices at CMMC Level 1. Again, I apologize for the late delay, or late start, excuse me. Gavin, do you have any final thoughts for the audience?
No, I just want to close with saying, it's really, I know with CMMC, especially when you get to higher levels, there's a lot of practices to be implemented, but these practices aren't new. They've been out for the last couple years, but take each practice and really identify what the objectives are. And this is your opportunity to tell the assessor how you're doing these things. So again, these weren't written with specific technology in mind. Now, specific technology may lend itself to specific practices, but that's not a barrier to entry there. It's what works for your organization and how you are satisfying the objectives. And that's really going to put you down the right path to have that conversation with the assessor and move forward.
Right. I couldn't agree more, Gavin. It's about the what, not the how. So what I would encourage, so we just use 171A as a guideline for how we would interpret the practices at level 1. Just do the same and start to construct a narrative within your organization. So you're going to scope it appropriately or determine the scope, and then you're going to see how your organization meets the objectives of each of the requirements. So folks, thanks very much for attending today's webinar. If you'd like to work with the SCI, you can go to our website at www.scI.cmu.edu, click on the About link on the left side, and click on Work with Us. Once again, thanks very much for attending today's webcast.